So, based on this slide, you all can see that my presentation is on the making of the Stonewall myth. And before I get into it, I wanted to use this time and space to honor an influential advocate and member of the queer community, Marsha P. Johnson. I was kind of surprised that there was no mention of them in the reading whatsoever, especially with how much Stonewall is mentioned, because you can't really read something about Stonewall without hearing about Marsha P. Johnson. So, in not hearing about her, I just wanted to take this space to acknowledge her. So, um, the question this reading seeks to answer is, why is Stonewall remembered over other acts of resistance? So, I know many of us may have not heard of these other acts of resistance or events before this reading, but the point is they existed. So why are they not remembered in the same way that Stonewall is? Because Stonewall wasn't the first or last of its kind. There were movements that came after it. It didn't occur in the most liberal city in the 1960s, or the most privileged, where we would assume most progressive movements would be taking place. And then there weren't any fatal injuries or any deaths in Stonewall. So the authors have a few modes of measurements when it comes to an event's success. So success is reliant on collective memory of what happened, and these memories can be contrived, but if successful, it's a collective memory nonetheless. And a collective memory is basically just like the idea of what happened. And the way you build on collective memory, the authors have these four tools. The two main ones that they used are highlighted on the slide. So collective memory is built upon commemorability and, I hate this word, mnemonic capacity. So commemorability to me is the capacity for something to be respected, and mnemonic capacity is the ability for something to be easily remembered. So there are two, I guess, sub tools that are used to build collective memory, and those are resonance and institutionalization. So resonance is just the ability to be relatable, and institutionalization is basically just going mainstream. And all four of these need to be present for a movement to be successful. And then I put a little formula on the side because that's kind of what I thought of. So it all equates to collective memory, which equates to success. So that was the long and surprisingly mathy answer for social work. So the short answer is other acts of resistance paved the way for Stonewall's success. So Stonewall was able to be a success because of the work other advocates put into the movement before it. So all of this takes place in the 60s and the 70s, and we didn't have the luxury of social media to mobilize a national movement. So platforms had to be developed so the community can meet on a national level. Network connections had to be made with media just so the word could be spread, and even just having the idea to hold a parade annually is something that had to be thought of because it wasn't done before. So while this reading defines Stonewall as a success, it was a collective effort as a whole by the community. And I've included the other names of the events that are included in this reading just in case you didn't get to it or you didn't know about them and you want to just see them again. I'm honoring them by including their names. So we had the New Year's Ball in 1965, Compton's Cafeteria in 1966, the Black Cat Raid in 1967, and the Snake Pit Bar that was after Stonewall in 1970. So what we've learned from Stonewall or its creation is that movements don't just appear out of nowhere. So while we may not hear or see them, they're still in the works of reaching the point of institutionalization. And that's kind of where we start to hear and see about them because they're hitting the mainstream. But there's a lot of footwork that we don't see before that happens. Um, and then power plays a big role in a movement's visibility. So this power and privilege is beneficial when trying to reach a mainstream audience, especially in the 60s and 70s. Like you had to have a lot of connections to get the word out so your movement could be heard about nationally or even just like throughout a city. But those with power aren't always the first responders to a problem. This paper touches on this like for maybe one paragraph, unfortunately. But I'll touch on it later in my critiques. And then authorities have a lot of influence when it comes to movements like this. So even being able to assemble or be outwardly queer is a luxury that we have. So without that, we wouldn't see movements like Stonewall be a success or a success. So I have a few critiques for this paper. First of all, I'm lost. So this paper jumps around a lot. So in one sentence, I was in New York in like 1967, and then the next sentence, I'll be in San Francisco in like 1962. So there are just like a lot of dates, times, events, references that are talked about in an unorganized way, and it kind of just it gets confusing. Um, and I just feel like this reading was unnecessarily dense. And I understand that it's trying to explain sociology or mechanisms of sociology and how movements are built, but I don't know. I just don't like academic jargon that's it. I guess just serves to be academic. It kind of just takes away from the understanding or the ability to understand a reading. And then I guess a critique of mine would be that in in defining success or what a successful movement is, it kind of implies that these other movements were not successful because they're not recognized on a mainstream level. Um, so I mentioned earlier that it's a collective effort. So while these other movements aren't like recognized on a national level, they were still a success because they took part in paving the way for what we call liberation. And then um, this paper doesn't acknowledge grassroots activists. So this reading doesn't really mention anyone specifically besides one person, and I think their name was like Craig Rodney or something. And that's only because this person was privileged enough to have connections with the press and the media to get the word out. And I feel like them mentioning that person so heavily only works to like imply that he was why the Stonewall riots were a success when there were plenty of activists like Marsha P. Johnson who have been activists the entire time and were super influential. But because they don't have those privileges, they are not mentioned. The only time they mention other communities is like when they're describing groups of people who are at certain bars or establishments. So these groups include Queens, Street Kids, and I quote, those not welcome anywhere else. And I think they're using coded language to describe trans and queer people of color when they could have just used those words in the first place. That and after reading this entire paper, they use the word homophile so much, and it's annoying to me at this point. So, just using different adjectives, I guess, to describe a movement. And then this is just kind of a PSA. I just wanted to note that the gay or queer movement that we're reading about in this paper is not the gay movement that we see today. So The queer movement that Marsha P. Johnson was fighting for was for not just the liberation of gays, bisexual people, lesbians, and everyone else. Well, omit everyone else. Gays, lesbians, and bi people. The L's, the G's, and the B's. Specifically, white gay people. Marsha P. Johnson and the queer movement were fighting for the liberation of all people, including trans and queer people of color. So I just wanted to acknowledge that there's a difference in what the original meaning was and what we are seeing today. Because the movement being institutionalized, while it did make it a successful movement and it gave us a platform for these changes, it kind of created a new collective memory. So I included an article. I'm not going to keep going about it. There's an article right there. If you want to check it out, go for it. But yeah. And then my discussion questions are here. I'm not going to read them off. I will let you all read them. And then that is my presentation. I hope that provided some clarity. Thank you.